to the cloud. Hello, everyone. Give me a second. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel entitled The War in Ukraine, Reflections of a Russian-Ukrainian Immigrant. I'm Navid Fauzi from the Anthropology Department. I welcome the audience and my colleagues from the Global Migration Studies Work Group, Drs. Fyodor Gostchev, Rachel Navar, and Siddhita Kushi. Thanks to Dr. Winkay To, who has kindly accepted to moderate this session. As many of you know, the Global Migration Work Group has been working for some time now to develop a program and minor in international migration studies. The work group has assembled an advisory board of 20 faculty members, invited the scholars to address different aspects of migration, created a webpage for the prospective program, compiled relevant courses for the minor, and developed and will be offering an introductory course in international migration studies next fall, and I will be sharing the flyer with you shortly. This current installment draws on the immediate experiences of Dr. Gostchev and scholarly grounded discussions of Drs. Kushi and Navar regarding the ongoing Russian war and atrocities in Ukraine. Without further ado, let me briefly introduce our panelists and moderator. Dr. Fyodor Gostchev is an associate professor of criminal justice. Born and raised in Crimea, Dr. Gostchev immigrated to the United States nearly 20 years ago. He has family and friends in Crimea and traveled there most recently in 2018. In this talk, he will draw on his childhood memories and observations made during his most recent trip to Russia to highlight how Russian culture and public opinion have shaped Ukraine-Russia relations and seek to better understand the causes of and consequences of the current conflict in Ukraine. Dr. Siddhita Kushi is an assistant professor of political science at Bridgewater State University and a non-residential fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She has served as a research director at the Center for Strategic Studies, where she led the military intervention project. Dr. Kushi is the author of various academic articles published in Comparative European Politics, European Security and International Labor Review, Mediterranean Quarterly, the Journal of Science, Policy and Governance, amongst others. Her co-authored book on US military interventions across history is forthcoming in 2022 from Oxford University Press. Dr. Rachel Navar is an assistant professor of political science at Bridgewater State University. After completing her degree at the University of Texas, Austin, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Inter-American Policy at Tulane University in New Orleans. Her research focuses on comparative public policy, specifically immigration policy and politics, populism and democratic discontent, and public opinion. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Politics, the Journal of Experimental Political Science, and the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. She recently co-authored Immigration in the 21st Century and provided a chapter on US immigration policy in the edited volume entitled The Future of US Empire in the Americas. Her co-authored book, The Age of Discontent, Populism, Extremism, and Conspiracy Theories in Contemporary Democracies, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. And Dr. Winkay To is the Assistant Provost for Global Engagement and the Senior International Officer at BSU. Dr. To is also a former faculty member in the History Department for 2 decades. He oversees BSU's comprehensive internationalization project on campus. He has been supporting our initiatives for international migration studies and developing campus events relating to Ukraine and refugee issues as a three-part series in March and April. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. To, and please join me welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Fossey. I should also add that Dr. Fossey is the coordinator of MENA studies of Middle East and North African studies, and also, as you know, a faculty member in the anthropology department. And Dr. Fossey has been working with all the other faculty members here today for a series of projects about global migrations, as he mentioned, but especially the Global Scholar Series that cover a number of lectures all this academic year, connecting transnational, issues and migration issues to educate the community. And I mentioned this because today's panel discussion is more or less a continuation of this kind of perspective, and thinking about global migration and refugees and wars, and not as something that happened in a vacuum. And it has transnational dimensions and international dimensions that affect all of us in this global age. And especially from a personal perspective, if you think about, individuals, faculty members who have transnational backgrounds, and myself being a Chinese American myself, when something happens in China and Hong Kong, and which is where I'm originally from, I'm always asked about my own opinions, about my own identities, how to navigate these kinds of political issues that affected all of us. So we're very pleased to have faculty members from all over the world who are teaching at BSU, who can offer multiple perspectives. And sometimes we call this the in-between spaces, or you're not always just in one space. You're actually navigating your transnational and identities across different countries. So today we have three perspectives, one from Dr. Gosjev, and then from Dr. Khushi and Dr. Navari, and they represent three different perspectives. And Dr. Gosjev is going to speak about, being someone who is from the region, originally born in Crimea, and have Russian and Ukrainian kind of background and histories, and how and came here when he was very young, and he will speak about these kinds of topics. Then Dr. Khushi will speak about her experiences as someone from very familiar with the Balkan region that was in conflict over a long period of time and has been doing research in the region. So she would have a broader European perspective. And last but not least, Dr. Navari has been doing research about immigration in the United States, and especially from the political perspective. And she will also shed light on this issue as well. So I'll first turn to Dr. Gosjev to give us his opinions about the Ukraine crisis and war.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Let me talk a little bit about what I'm going to try to do here. So I wanted to start with kind of a quick tour of my background, supported with some maps to just kind of see where geographically, like how my sort of ties to Ukraine and Russia are structured geographically. I then want to show some pictures, which are all from my most recent visit to Crimea, which was in 2018. And then basically offer some reflections. Again, I kind of have a lot in my outline, so I may, some of the things I may kind of just throw out there, and we can dig into them deeper during the Q&A, or I might cut some stuff out. So we're kind of going to play by ear in this respect. And of course, the disclaimer. So I'm going to. Because this is a relative, this is a very, sensitive situation. I'm gonna, not disclose identities of the people I'm talking about. Some of serving kind of a reverse role of public Morozov in this, Also, disclaimer, much more accustomed to academic talks. I do not have a background in political science or international relations. So much of what I'm saying should be treated more or less as anecdotal, in a sense that, even during my visit in 2018, although my curiosity got the best of me and eventually I got comfortable and started asking questions. But I did not go in 2018 to do a comprehensive survey. I wasn't there for research. I was there to visit my friends and relatives who I haven't seen in almost a decade. So basically, I will offer a little bit, with very carefully tread into this more analytical academic perspective in the end. But again, that's why I have my colleagues in political science to, to provide more academically grounded perspective. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen to show you geographically. I thought I had a map set up. Sorry about that. Oh, I do have a map set up. Great. Okay, so here's the map of Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula is this very southern peninsula in the Black Sea across from Turkey. So I was born in 1985 in the capital city of Crimean Republic, which is Simferopol. But my entire family hails from area near Yalta, which you may have heard of because of the famous Yalta Conference, which is where after World War II, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met to essentially carve up post-World War II world into spheres of influence. And so this is the famous photograph you may have seen of three of them sitting on the bench in Livadia Palace, right outside of Yalta in the mountains that used to be Tsar's palace. So, if you go on tour there, you can see the bench where they're set. And so most of my family was in Yalta because basically my entire family is scientists, mostly agricultural scientists. And they all worked at some point for Nikitin Botanical Garden, which you'll see a few pictures there, which is probably one of the most pristine botanical gardens and a center for sort of agricultural research during the Soviet era. So I was born in 85. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster happened, which is when the nuclear power plant in the north of Ukraine, so we're going to go there. So it's north of Kiev, Kiev being the capital city. Chernobyl is right there. So the nuclear power plant blows up in 86. I am one at that point, and my parents, being geneticists, basically picked up, and we moved to area near Ivankiv, which is this village right here. Actually was a little further out of town, basically, so my parents could do research on how the radiation affected the ecosystem, the people, and et cetera. So do genetics research. So unfortunately, my biological father passed away in '94 when I was 9. And so my mother shipped me off to my grandparents, which shipped me off is not a good word. I mean, my grandparents were, a big part of my family. So I pretty much spent the rest of my time in Russia and Ukraine, in Nikitin area, in Yalta area, while my mother was abroad, basically trying to continue the research that they started. And that's where she met my stepfather, who is American, and so therefore, in 2002, I finally moved to the United States, to Winchester, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. So the one interesting thing about doing this talk is this summer is going to be my 20th year anniversary exactly of moving to the United States. So I I had a long hiatus before going back. And so in 2018, I had to get a Russian visa to go visit back, visit back in Crimea. Now, while this was going on, obviously geopolitically, Soviet Union falls apart in 91. Crimea becomes a part of Ukraine, except for the city of Sebastopol, which is a Russian naval base that remained essentially autonomous and in the hands of Russia. But while Crimea was part of Ukraine, it had a status of an autonomous republic. One of the big implications of this, most of the population in Crimea is ethnically Russian. So Russian was the official state language. That's what was taught and taught in school. And then, of course, years after I moved in 2015, Crimea was, as you know, annexed by Russia and still remains in Russian hands. Let me go to some pictures here. So this is the view from Nikita, basically my town, over the bay. It should be mentioned that Crimea is kind of the premier vacation destination for all of Russian Federation. So this is where a lot of expensive hotels are, very expensive real estate. So in terms of post-Soviet republics, this is one of the sort of premier places to go for vacation. This is a picture of a nuclear bomb shelter that was in our town. So this is the remnants from the Cold War, where as kids were instructed that if nuclear attack happened, this is where we would go to hide. This is some pictures from the Kinnan Botanical Garden. So you see it's, quite a beautiful area with, lots of flower expositions, plants. This is downtown Yalta city. So I was there during a celebration of Yalta's 180 something year anniversary when becoming a city. But this is kind of an emphasis here. So that one thing I'm going to sort of emphasize is in Putin's Russia, there was just noticeable buildup of this sort of very explicit culture that tried to instill kind of pride and very nationalistic view. So these sort of holidays were really high profile because this was sort of a chance for showcasing kind of the Russian pride. This is the statue of Lenin, who you may know as one of the sort of communist leaders, one of the founders of Soviet Union. This is just to show that many of the statutes from the Soviet era and sort of many of these things remain in Russia. So again, you may have seen a lot of footage of statues getting taken down, but many of the statues are still up. So there's still these deep connections between sort of Russia and the Soviet era. Of course, you also may know that the Russian anthem currently, although the words have been changed to no longer say Soviet Union, is the Soviet anthem. So there's a lot of this sort of cultural continuity from the Soviet era. So this is downtown. This is one of the hotels, premier hotels in Crimea. Some more views from my town. This is other surrounding towns. So this is where the house of Chekhov, which is a famous Russian poet and playwright, was located. I actually went to middle school right outside of this area. So this is interesting because we were in Crimea after annexation, and so Crimea was under sanctions and most American businesses could not do business there. And you may have heard on the news that when McDonald's and other companies pulled out of Russia recently over the invasion of Ukraine, that the trend has been to basically keep these places, but just with names that resemble their Western origins, but otherwise are completely Russian. So you see Starbucks. I don't have the McDonald's one, but there was a McDonald's also picture. This is in Sebastopol, which is, the Russian military base, naval base that remained in the hands of Russia even when Ukraine was in possession of Crimea. And so Sebastopol is kind of their cultural image as this city that has been constantly under siege from the West. And to a degree, there is historical truth to this because this was the epicenter of Crimean War. There was a brutal siege during World War II. But interestingly, so they have this basically exposition of pictures that goes through this sort of military history of Sebastopol, but ends, of course, with Vladimir Putin. So this kind of shows you how sort of the image of Russia that Putin's Russia has been crafting is very sort of carefully integrates him as sort of the great continuity of this sort of tradition of Russian strength and sort of defense. This is the monument to the sunken ships during the Crimean War. So Russians sunk their ships on purpose so that the British ships could not come into the Sebastopol harbor. This is other monuments commemorating, this commemorates World War II, but you can see the flowers and the flag is the Russian flag next to the fire commemorating the grave of an unnamed soldier. This is the statue of Alexander III, who was a brutal ruler who arguably created the path for the Tsarist Russia to fall and eventually, Russia through revolutions become communist. So this is interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural shift in Russia and cultural shift in the sense that things like smoking cigarettes, severe alcohol abuse have really been shifted to being culturally frowned upon. And so this shows you the pack of cigarettes, where you display sort of terrible, consequences of smoking cigarettes, but it shows the point that it's interesting that Russian culture kind of shift towards, trying to frown upon these sort of behaviors that a lot of Russian people engaged in. This is some Soviet memorabilia maintained in my house. Oh, and this is the airport in Simferopol, which you can see they spent tremendous amount of money. So this was built after Russian takeover. It has a live wall that requires people to maintain the plants that grow on it and such. And this is me just outside of Kremlin. Let's see. So that's my picture exposition. Okay, and so basically the remarks I wanted to make, first of all, my kind of memories of when the Soviet Union falls apart. I think it's becoming more apparent now, but when I first immigrated to United States, a lot of people I talked to had this perception that when Soviet Union fell, that there was this sort of sense of liberation among the Russian people. And that certainly was not my experience. So I can tell you, again, I don't have a full survey of how all Russians felt about the failure of Soviet Union. And I do have to say that in the Soviet system, my family was more privileged than most families. So this could also be coming from the standpoint that, the circle of my family is, had more to lose in the failure of Soviet Union. But this was from what I saw as a child, this was a grave tragedy for, at least older people that we knew. Of course, it led to really turbulent economic times, hyperinflation. I was telling my students the other day that I remember paying, 100 million for a lunch in school, or the bus ticket being 10 million because of the sort of hyperinflation. There was this major sort of privatization campaign because under Soviet Union there was no really private ownership of major industries, but this really played out more like a game of musical chairs, where basically whoever was sitting in the chair at the time end up gaining tremendous sort of power and access to money versus the rest of the country was impoverished by essentially the privatization. There was also huge concerns about not huge concerns, but there was an interesting relationship with versus sort of the Western culture and influence right after the Soviet Union fell, in a sense that on one hand, you finally started to see sort of American and foreign-made products being more available, but at least people I know were extremely apprehensive. So this is the time where you see a lot of more Russians growing their own food because people were afraid of chemicals and preservatives that were added to the foreign foods. But at the same time, there was a lot of cultural integration because, interestingly, thinking about my upbringing, I did not grow up with, Russian action films. I was watching the same American action films that I'm presumed people in the 90s growing up here were watching. Most of the music we listened to was American music, American bands. So I was always a big fan of Metallica. A bunch of my friends were huge fans of rap music, like Public Enemy, Onyx, the popular band, hip hop bands back then. So there was this weird integration, while at the same time, especially the older generation remaining kind of apprehensive about what this all kind of meant. Now, on the side of kind of the cultural trends, right? Because, so what's the perception of Ukraine? There was certainly, Russian culture was not at all immune from ethnocentrism, racism, and essentially racist notions, which I'm saying because, when I came to America, there was this perception that, I feel like that, racism is especially a big issue in America, and more sort of homogenous countries like Russia don't have as much of it. I can honestly tell you that's not the case. So there was, I think, especially, anti-Semitism was well integrated into, Russian humor, Russian jokes. But interestingly, not in the way that sort of saw Jewish people as inferior. It was more essentially presenting him as kind of a model minority, and talking about sort of that essentially Jewish people are not to be trusted because behind the scenes they run run the global system, right? Which is eerily similar to kind of the arguments that Hitler makes, right? So it's like, Hitler's justification largely is because sort of this sort of conspiracy theory about, Jews trying to essentially take over the world. There was also a lot of racism. Crimea is a home to Tatar population, which is an Islamic minority group. Now, there was almost a cultural conditioning to create this sort of hateful view of them, because a lot of Russian history basically tells the story of invasion from Mongolia, from Genghis Khan, and etc., which terrorized Russia. So you even kind of have the narratives in Russia basically saying that the reason Europe was able to have its Renaissance is because the Russians paid with blood for the invasion of, Middle Eastern and Mongolian tribes. And so this sort of image was inadvertently attached to this Islamic minority who largely had nothing to do with these invasions. So, I mean, if there was a, version of racism in my growing up, it was definitely the Tatars were the main target, but obviously, this kind of spilled out onto any individual who had sort of a Middle Eastern look to him. So it actually was somewhat irrelevant whether you're Tatar. It was more something that was sort of levied against more Middle Eastern people. Now, as far as Ukrainian, there was certainly, jokes and derogatory terms for Ukrainian, but the perception has been very much that Ukrainians and Russians are essentially the same people. I had a friend whose mother was Ukrainian, and we cracked jokes, but it was always sort of the perception that there's this common sort of commonality to this. Like, to give you an example, so when soccer teams would play, if Russian teams lost, people would root for the Ukrainian team, type of deal. But there was definitely some conflict around politics. So when Crimea became part of Ukraine, especially the older generation perceived the some of the moves that Ukraine has made following the failure of Soviet Union as kind of affront to Russians. But again, I think it's fair to say that the older generation was more adamant about it. So, for instance, earlier on, we're talking about names. So one thing that rubbed the Russian population the wrong way is when we received our Ukrainian passports, Ukraine went ahead and translated the names, which is a very unusual move, into Ukrainian sounding names without sort of people's consent. Again, as a kid, this didn't matter to me. I had no interest, but older generation was very aggrieved about it. We had to take Ukrainian language, which again, to me, to the kids was fine. If anything, I was a little ashamed because I wasn't very good at speaking Ukrainian. I wanted to speak Ukrainian, but in the older generation, the perception was, well, they're forcing this on our children. The other thing is teaching history, right? So now you're essentially, in Russia, it's prohibited to teach about Holodomor, which is the incident where Stalin essentially starved roughly 5 million Ukrainians to death in 1930s. We were taught this in school. And again, the perception is now that this makes Russian children feel bad about who they are. And I can tell you that, as somebody who went through these classes, I didn't have feeling one way or the other. And I don't think any of my, Russian friends had either. I mean, this was just history, just something that happened. And it was more sort of older Russian generation that was concerned that we're being taught these sort of anti-Russian perspectives. Now, so I can turn it over to other presenters. My visit during 2018, again, I didn't do a very comprehensive investigation of anything that's been going on. But one of the major things that I sort of noticed is this really tremendous cultural shift in trying to build, one of the many podcasts I've heard of over the last few months concluded that what essentially Putin has been trying to build culturally is the culture of Russian exceptionalism. So the idea that Russians are inherently superior culturally and sort of are essentially a clean and I guess almost puritanical nation. So obviously it's well known that Russia had tremendous issues with alcoholism and sort of consumption of alcohol. My visit in 2018, there certainly were still people affected, essentially people who are alcoholics. But compared to when I left, where you could essentially see, people drinking vodka from very early in the morning in any parts of town, of almost any town, my friends very clearly told me that this is now very much frowned upon, and that you have this that Putin is trying to build a much sort of cleaner Russia. In a similar vein, my friends were horrified when I told them that I'm from a state of Massachusetts that just legalized marijuana, right? So the idea that I live in a state where we can go and if you're a certain age purchase marijuana, which is fairly seriously sanctioned in Russia, as we know. There's a WNBA athlete being held right now on having hashish oil being discovered in her luggage. This was something that really sort of shook people that there was access to marijuana, but nothing really, from what I saw, disturbed people more than when my wife and I discussed that we have decided not to have children. And so pretty much anybody would talk to just could not sort of fathom this idea that people could decide not to have children. And a lot of these cultural trends, I think on the surface of it seem like a good thing, but, and this is my sort of concluding thought, I would suggest, so this is my academic part, that what Putin's really been trying to build is a essentially culture of Christian nationalism in Russia, which is where sort of the idea of this, you may remember when Putin announced the operation, he said that, I'm going after Nazis and drug addicts, right? Nobody's really been discussing this drug addicts part because it's so bizarre and odd. But to me, after visiting there, it makes sense because it's this idea that the culture that Putin is selling, that's kind of propping up public opinion, that's supporting this, brutal invasion, is the idea that Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt and it's been sort of corrupted by these loose morals from the West that permit drug use, that discourage childbirth, right? And in my opinion, and I will see how the political scientists would say about this, I think this sort of Christian nationalism culture is essential for Putin, because if you do not keep the sort of culturally and economically and socially marginalized groups oppressed, they eventually will support opposition parties. Putin cannot afford to have an opposition party because he essentially is a criminal who, for the last 20 years, has been committing crimes in the open. If Putin ever lost power and opposition power came to power in Russia, any basic investigation would uncover tremendous amount of corruption that enriched him and his friends. So the only way to continue this sort of kleptocracy is to build a culture that that's really based on sort of this Christian nationalist, puritanical notion of Russian exceptionalism. And so I think this is playing a lot of role in terms of how sort of the Russian people today view and why, besides the state propaganda, which is, of course, is powerful and important, why Russians tend to, unfortunately, in Russia, support this brutal invasion. Okay, sorry, I know it took a lot of time, but I think we got through it.
Well, thank you, Fred. I think it's very helpful to talk about your experiences and from very young to your recent visit in 2018 and what you observed about what's going on in terms of what Russia is thinking about the territories like Crimea and Ukraine, and what Ukrainian perspective might be just from your exposure to that period of time. I'll bring in Siddhartha Kushi, and who might bring along a broader European perspective, if she would.
Of course, thank you so much. I really appreciated the perspective that was just given. So what I will do is add my own both academically oriented and also mildly personal perspective. A little background on my academic interests is that I tend to focus on researching humanitarian military interventions, as well as broader Western military interventions. But another line of my research relates to my own personal upbringing within the Western Balkans, Albania, and Kosovo. And at the personal level, the way that Russia and Ukraine relate to this other region within Europe is that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, so did Yugoslavia very shortly afterwards. And with the breakdown of Yugoslavia, similar to the Soviet Union, you had separate identities, separate republics eventually forming in the early to mid 1990s. And especially within the breakdown of Yugoslavia, you had a lot of civil wars break out, a lot of instances of mass civilian casualties and crimes and ethnic cleansing that arose in the aftermath of Yugoslavia. So there are parallels to discuss between the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the impact it had not just across former Soviet republics, but within the Western Balkans, within former Yugoslavia. And there's also the parallel to be made about coming from a part of the world, from a country that is not a great power, from a country that is usually a pawn of great power politics. And from a part of the world where when they discuss the plight of those citizens on the ground, they rarely discuss it from the perspective of that country's people. It's instead discussed within the narrative of one great power versus another. And as often is the case with discussing Russia's war in Ukraine today, we often see it as a discussion between the European Union, the United States, and Russia. Rarely do we see it as a direct agency when talking about Ukraine. So that is the perspective I come from. So I will bring in both a little bit of data, a little bit of history, and hopefully some personal narrative into the mix. I will try to keep it short, so please stop me whenever it seems like I'm not giving enough time to our next wonderful presenter. So I will start off with a very basic, more academically, historically oriented background on Russia after the end of the Cold War, mainly to follow up on why I think Russia is behaving this way in foreign policy. So I would argue to understand the motivations behind Russia's military intervention in Ukraine today, it's extremely vital to first examine the role of Russia in the post-Cold War international system. So in the decade following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia did indeed see its economy severely weakened and its position as a great power diminished. The early transition, as our previous presenter mentioned, away from the Soviet system to a market-based economy was a time of great economic chaos for the average Russian citizen and for Russia as a country. And during this period, the Russian economy lost almost 30% of its GDP. That is a very significant collapse in economic growth. It had extremely high rates of inflation, which led to the collapse of the ruble, and a majority of citizens saw their savings vanish. And this is something that we also saw in the Western Balkans after the end of the Cold War. The economy of Western Balkan countries collapsed. The early 1990s was a time of chaos, political turmoil, and political violence. So at the personal level, I can also understand this as I have also experienced it in my own home. Now, this traumatic event left an extremely lasting mark on Russian foreign policy. It wasn't just a blip in history. It wasn't just a personal anecdote to discuss, although that is extremely important. But President Putin has gone so far as to refer to the 1991 collapse of the USSR as, I quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. So there is a lot of political resentment, identity-based resentment, beginning after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So many in Russia, including members of the current leadership, but also members of the opposition, perceive Western countries as central to Russia's decline from great power status during this timeline. So Russians blame policies of liberalization and privatization recommended by Western institutions and experts such as the IMF and the World Bank for weakening their global economic and political power. So the result of this has been a sense of victimhood in Russian politics and a great mistrust of the West. And this suspicion of the West extends to international institutions such as, of course, NATO, the World Bank, the IMF, and of course, the European Union, which are seen as established by and favoring only the interests of the United States and its European allies. Now, in the early to mid 1990s, Russia had very weakened state capacity. So if you look at its history of military interventions in the 1990s, they were pretty minimal. And the argument in academic literature is that this wasn't due to lack of political will or a switched foreign policy priority. It was due to weakened state capacity. There was no ability to extend itself within the near broad in Russia. But by the 2000s, Russia had regained economic stability, largely due to lucrative oil and natural gas exports. Political power, of course, also became more consolidated under Putin's leadership. With this return to economic growth and strengthened political leadership, Russian foreign policy has become much more confrontational, with Russia now seeking to reassert itself as a major international power. But here it becomes especially to talk about the connections between identity and geopolitical power, because a lot of international relations scholars point directly to geopolitics as an explanation for Russia's increased aggression within its neighborhood and the near broad. That is partially correct. It is partially correct that Russia is threatened by the presence of NATO and the European Union right within what it regards as its geopolitical historical sphere of influence. So what Russian leadership is saying to the West is, I do not feel secure unless I'm able to dominate over my sphere of influence that is much of Eastern Europe. And this is how they see this as justified based on their history, based on their background. But beyond this, it is a matter of cultural identity and connections. Because as other scholars have argued, Russia does not feel the same sense of insecurity when looking at the possible growing power and economic might of China or other international actors. The threat and the geopolitical insecurity is centered squarely on the West. So there is a connection here between the cultural identities that are being supported and fermented within Russia and geopolitical threat assessment. Russian foreign policy sees the West as the greatest threat, despite the material realities. It sees it as a threat because of the cultural connections between geopolitics and Russia's history. And something important to consider in this case is that a lot of scholars look at Putin and say that Putin is to blame for Russia's current foreign policy, especially in Ukraine, but also in Crimea and Georgia. Well, that is also partially correct. But if you look at some of the data coming out of surveys and polls, the opposition movement, including Navalny, also supports Russia's great expanded role within the near broad. So even Russian opposition holds the similar ideas about Russian exceptionalism, Russian influence within Eastern Europe. So this isn't just a Putin issue. This isn't just a regime issue. This extends deeper even into opposition movements that do want to see Putin out of power. They still hold to very similar cultural and geopolitical assessments of Russia's role in the world. And I do want to close, if I may, just another couple of minutes, with the importance of the Russian government shaping the narrative. So we've heard about that, quite a bit, and it was extremely valuable. I hope everyone agrees with that. But in my research, I study the impact of conflict perceptions on international responses to humanitarian crises. And I study this because coming out of the Western Balkans, I grew up and there was international support for my people, the Albanians, when horrible, terrible things were happening. So something bad happened in my homeland, and the United States and the West eventually stepped in and helped. But I realized later on when I became an adult that this didn't just happen for everyone else. So I noticed an extreme gap between who was seen as worthy of protection and who was not. And in many cases, the dichotomy was that if you are a European, you seem to be worthy of international protection. If you are not a European, you get to suffer on your own. So I've studied conflict perceptions because I'm interested in finding out what explains this gap between humanitarian responses across the world. And I've come to learn, based on my research, both data-driven and fieldwork-driven, that if international political elites understand an international conflict as a one-sided conflict, as opposed to a both sides conflict, the international response differs dramatically. So let me give you an example. If the international community forms a consensus and says that Russia is squarely to blame for its war against Ukraine, this becomes a one-sided conflict of systematic violence against innocent parties. If, however, Russia is successful in framing its war in Ukraine as a both sides conflict, as in both Ukrainians and Russians are partly to blame, both the West and Russia are to blame, this becomes a narrative that I have labeled as a civil war kind of narrative, where both sides are to blame. There are no, innocent civilian victims. There are no, bad actors. In some way, both sides are to blame. When the both sides narrative kicks in, the international responses diminish greatly. So it's very important for Russian politics and for Putin to be able to use the narrative of both sides to be able to hold off on more international backlash. So a lot of the ethnic and nationalist rhetoric within Russia, I would argue, has a lot to do with maintaining a very favorable narrative for its foreign policy actions within Ukraine, within other parts of Eastern Europe, and as a way to deal with the Western rivalry, to say that, hey, you are not better than me. You know, we are the same in some way. And if we are the same, then you can't condemn me and you can't go after me in this way. So narratives matter, conflict perceptions matter, especially when talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine today. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Sedita. That's very helpful to frame it in the context of rationale and justification for military action and how that might pose different questions about ethics and also responsibilities, which lie into a very complex debate about, the role of Russia and, the West, and how the two actually perceive each other over time differently. And more in the present time, there was a great source of tension, all over the world in terms of this, what some people have called a new Cold War kind of possibility emerging, versus the long history of Russia's military action. I think last decade we were more focused on the U.S. imperialism and some of our military intervention, and this kind of reminds me back to the 1980s with Afghanistan, with the Soviet Union, and also in the early 1990s, as you pointed out, about the Balkans and also the the end of the Soviet republics. Rachel, you're a specialist in U.S. immigration, and we've had the pleasure of working with you and Fedor last year, talking about immigration policy in the Biden administration. And a year later, we're not just talking about immigration and COVID, we're talking about a war happening in Europe and the Biden administration's policies. I wonder what your perspective would be in terms of what you study and what you think about this war.
Well, hello, everybody. So as Dr. Winkai said, I am, immigration is kind of my first main focus. But along with that, and the reason I'm here today is because I also study democratic discontent and especially the rise of the far right. My work focuses, especially the book that we're producing, focuses a lot on populism. My advisor wrote one of the big works about the rise of the far right in Western Europe, and that's kind of how I actually got into immigration policy, is I was very interested in the far right, and one of the things the far right really is interested in is about, immigration, nationalism, things like that. So what I'm here, so I am more of an American and European specialist, or Western European specialist than I am Eastern European. Unlike the other two presenters, I don't have a personal connection to the region, but what I am here to offer is basically to act as, if anyone does have questions about, refugees and why we're seeing Poland act differently, in this refugee crisis than they have in, in the previous refugee crisis, I can answer that in the question and answer. We'll also have a talk next week on refugees in general that Dr. Winkai is going to be hosting as well. But what I want to talk about too is the claims of Nazification and the claims of what Russia has been doing and Russia's narrative about the far right in Ukraine. So the first thing I'm going to say is, yes, Ukraine has a far right or Nazi problem. They're not alone. This is a problem throughout Europe. Actually, I didn't really create a slideshow or anything, but just to give you an idea, this is from the BBC, the best graphic representation I have. If you look at nationalist parties in Europe, in Hungary, Fidesz has 49% of the seats, Jobbik has 19%, in Austria, the Freedom Party has 26% of the seats, Switzerland, 25%, Finland, the Finns have 17%. In Netherlands, we see the Freedom Party with 13%. France National Rally has 13%. And just, a few days ago, we have a runoff In France, once again, it's between Le Pen from the Nationalist Party and I can't think of his name. You all know the black and white
Macron.
picture. Macron. Yes. Some reason I just forgot all that. So yes, so the far right is an issue, and Russia has actually been funding a lot of these far right groups. Now, to be fair to Russia, they have basically been throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. So they've been funding secessionist groups, but they've really been supporting and reaching out to a lot of these far right groups in the United States and Western Europe and in Latin America as well. So we're seeing a lot of overlap. And while, yes, there is a far right movement in Ukraine, they've been, oh, thank you, Aunt Young. They've been doing street marches and things like this. And there's the Azov battalion, which is a far right militia. It seems like, first off, they seem like Azov has pretty much been decimated. They've really allowed it to stay in the occupied regions, and they've had a lot of casualties and things like that. But they only made up, before this war, only about 5.1% of Ukraine's fighting force. The far right only won 2% of the vote in parliament in the last Ukrainian election in 2019, while Zelensky, who is of course Jewish, won 73% of the vote in the second round. They also do a runoff like France. And his party won 43% of the vote, which actually gave them a majority of seats in the House or in the lower house. So they are the only one, they have a majority party, they're not in coalition. All the other parties are very fragmented and small. So I also want to talk to you about ideology. So even though people are using a lot of historical frames. And they don't really work very well. So for example, this is not a replay of the Cold War. This is not the West versus communist. Russia is not communist. Russia is not Soviet. Okay, so while we see Putin talk about, in his speeches talking about he wants to recreate the Soviet sphere of influence, it's more almost not just the Soviet, but the Russian imperial project that he's hearkening back to. This is very, as Sadita said, and as Fed said, this is very tied up with this Christian kind of nationalist idea. This also isn't the world versus fascism, as Putin wants you to believe it is. Now, this is a very evocative frame for Russians. I mean, Russia is, during the Soviet time, this was really seen, Russia was the savior. They protected the world from fascism. We had Stalingrad, Leningrad, the protectors of the fatherland. So this is reaching back into these really very, this is back to America's founding myths kind of thing, with freedom and liberty and the city on a hill. So these are really important, and these are in people's lifetimes. People remember people that lived through the siege of Stalingrad. People remember the people that lived through the siege of, Leningrad. And these were, and all power to those people, because the civilians that made it through those two sieges were indeed, deserving of all the praise they got. But this is a story, though, that has a lot of resonance with not just Russia, people in Russia, but people who were in the Soviet sphere of influence, people who were on the other side of the West in the Iron Curtain. Because, they are the defenders. They were the first to fight. So while the West was off doing what America was doing, Russia was the Soviet Union was suffering and fighting, and they gave up so many of their children for this fight. So it creates this weird situation where you will hear things that parrot, like Fed said, that parrot fascist claims, that parrot Nazi claims, but they're being said by the people that are claiming to fight Nazis in the far right. So what I want to say is that, yeah, there's obviously, so if Azov hasn't been destroyed by this fighting, there's going to be a huge problem in Ukraine with all the weapons flooding in after. If Ukraine triumphs, there's going to be a problem, because anytime you have a conflict like this and you have a bunch of arms floating around afterwards, the aftermath, and you don't have a common enemy to focus on, the aftermath is negative. But this sort of idea that Russia, the denazification narrative, I really want to push back against that. The idea that this is a denazification, that the far right is more of a danger in Ukraine than it is in any other place in Europe, West or East, or that this is a battle between communism in the West or fascism in the West. If I wanted to be, well, I won't be political. I mean, you could see it as the West versus fascism, but that might be a little more political statement than the political scientist and me is willing to state. So that's it. I do have data if anyone wants some more information on any of this. I can send you some links. I will put a link that over some stuff that does go over Russia's ties to the far right throughout Europe in the chat. But I think it's a good time to open it up for questions and discussions.
Yeah, we have a lot of people in the audience, so really welcome some questions and comments and see if there's anything in the chat. Navid, I don't know. We haven't seen anything yet.
No, there is nothing.
One of my students privately messaged me a question. I don't know if I should go ahead and ask that question first, if there are others in the audience who'd like to ask a question. And this is for you, Fed. So my student says they had to leave to go to class, but they'd like to ask you a question. How is Crimea currently dealing with their lack of water and water crisis? The student has heard that the reservoir is very low, and the Russians said that they blew up the dam in Kherson to allow water flow back to Crimea. I don't know if you've heard anything.
That's such a fascinating question. No, it's spot on. When Crimea was annexed by Russia, this led to a whole new set of grievances by Crimean residents against Ukraine, which is interesting, right? Because Ukraine just literally lost part of its sovereign territory, and yet there's grievances. And one of the centerpieces of these grievances was the water coming from Ukraine. So Crimea relied on Ukraine for electricity and water. Crimea is a centerpiece of agriculture. Again, some of the most sort of fertile soils, and sort of, that's where a lot of wine comes from. That's where a lot of, all kinds of, that's kind of like the, not breadbasket, but like really tremendously important agricultural area. And it's interesting because, people of the older generation that I know in Russia repeatedly over the years brought up this issue that how upset they're with Ukraine for cutting off the water. And again, the idea that like, well, why wouldn't you cut off the water? They literally just, took over part of your country. Didn't seem to really resonate. And then the most recent conversations after the invasion began that I've had with people I know in Crimea, that was one of the first thing they brought up, is how happy they are that the water is flowing again. So that was the phrase that finally, Russia is here, they open the dam and would finally get this water. Ukrainians aren't keeping us from the water. So no, it was a major sort of part of sort of grievances, right? Because again, like my emphasis was that, at least from my perspective, there wasn't this sort of systematic cultural bias against Ukrainians. I mean, we did have derogatory words and jokes, but not to the degree that you saw against Tatars or against Jews, in my view. But it was this grievance base that basically Ukraine is trying to hurt Crimea because of the Russian sort of ethnic thing, and the water was a major part of it.
I'm going to send the recording over to my student so she can hear that response. If I may quickly add something to it, if that's okay. I think it's really interesting that the timeline that you present in terms of the Russian view on Ukrainians, because again, something similar happened within former Yugoslavia. And ethnic groups that were previously completely neutral in the cultural narrative of a country's political existence suddenly became extremely politicized. So prior to the breakdown of Yugoslavia, ethnic groups such as Muslim Bosnians, Croats, they were able to coexist side by side. And one of the quotes that I was able to hear was a Muslim Bosnian saying that I wasn't aware that I was Muslim until the Belgrade government made it a political issue. So the idea being that political elites mobilize ethnic identities and ethnic resentment and ethnic sentiment when they need to. So, prior perhaps to the more modern day, the ethnic Ukrainian division versus the ethnic Russian division was not as politically salient. But at this point in time, Russian leadership has understood that in order for them to continue on with their imperialist ambitions, they do need to heavily politicize the divisions between Ukrainians and Russians. And I don't necessarily think that was their initial plan. According to some of the documentation that we got from Russia, the initial plan seems to have been that as soon as the Russians invaded Ukraine, they would be seen as liberators. And the understanding was that the Ukrainians and Russians are so similar and perhaps the same group of people that the Ukrainians would welcome this Russian liberation, if you will. And now that it's not working, we are really doubling down on the politicization and the ethnic division against the Ukrainians, to the point where state media in Russia has said some pretty extreme things that are verging on intent to commit genocide against the ethnic Ukrainian group. That's it.
We got a question in the audience from Michael Yukovsky, and asking that many Ukrainian Americans believe the US government needs to step up and send our military more directly overseas to fight on the ground. However, other Russian Americans like myself believe this could worsen the situation and create a war. And how much should the US government be involved? And are we better off isolating from the situation completely, or could we do more? I don't know, any of you?
I came in real quick, although I think probably my colleagues might be better address. I just wanted to say that, like, part of, kind of like to personalize this a little bit, one of the challenges I've had in post-invasion talking to friends and relatives in Russia about basically kind of challenging the American narratives is it's almost the fact that I lived in the United States for 20 years, like I'm almost confirming what they expected, that like basically I've been indoctrinated into sort of this Western sort of liberal democratic thinking, and that I'm essentially puppet for the West, which has been, again, built in for decades, since Putin's rule, into sort of the Russian perception that basically anything bad that happens, the West is responsible, that they're there to undermine. So I think, well, unfortunately, the reality of the current situation is there's just no good solutions here. I mean, pretty much all outcomes, vast majority of outcomes, vast majority of anything we can do is just not like bad news. That's why this is so tremendously complicated. But again, like when I was I didn't watch much TV in Russia, but at one point, the TV was on and there was Russian news, and it caught my eye because the girl in the news had rainbow flags, so LGBT supporting color, which I didn't see anywhere at any point, because again, homosexuality is, LGBTQ community is very sort of legally under basically strict control. And I was like, oh, interesting, they're talking about LGBTQ rights. And I started listening, but it wasn't. They were talking about that this Russian activist for LGBTQ rights was really funded by the West. And so the first thing they showed is all these financial documents alleging that Western companies and Western individuals were transferring her money, and that her activism is not genuine, is just the West trying to undermine us. So I think basically anything that the West can do has to be perceived that it's essentially in a way playing into the cultural framework that Putin carefully constructed. even the sanctions, I forgot to mention this because this is an important part. When we started talking about sanctions when I was in Crimea in 2018, pretty much everybody said, you know, it's inconvenient, but we'll love your sanctions. So this is regular people saying this. And I was like, how could you love the sanctions? And they're like, well, because we now buy Russian, we're more Russian culture oriented. So bring on more sanctions, we're fine with this. This just brings us closer together and makes us feel like, you know, more sort of solidarity. So it's almost like, again, Putin, so his whole career is building these sort of manipulation of information perception. And so I think the tough part is from sanctions to sending weapons to people such as myself trying to, you know, talk my friends and relatives out of this complete madness on that side of the, you know, border is problematic because it's in a way playing into their hands. So it's like confirming their fears that the West is here to mess with them.
I'll just say something really quick and then turn it over to Sadida because she's better, especially with Ink Young's part, but very good question, Michael. I mean, this is, you know, we've talked about this in class with the fact of the matter is too, Russia has nuclear weapons. And I mean, this, Dr. Cushy and I actually talked about this before it started off. There's really no good solution here. You know, there's bad solutions and worse solutions. And, you know, so what can we do? What can we do that will not lead to the destruction of humankind or the world as we know it, while at the same time prevent things like genocide, chemical warfare? You know, we know what Russia's tactics look like. We've seen them in Syria. We've seen them in the Chechen wars. We know what they look like. And so we know that what's going to happen to Ukraine. The shootings that we're seeing now, like the kind of just random human rights things, those are a little bit new. Those kind of even go back. I mean, some of them, they kind of have similarities to some of the stuff in the Chechen wars, but not all that much. So, I mean, I think this is, you know, I think we have to balance we want to do something with, okay, what are we doing and what are we hoping the result is and what is the backstop? What do we supply weapons, okay, to whom and for how long and what sort of weapons? We do sanctions, okay, against whom? Like I mean, you know, I'm not really against reinstating letters of marque and letting people go steal oligarchs' yachts. I mean, you know, okay, fine. But when we're doing sanctions about that are affecting people's ability, the common people's ability to get medicines, things like that, how do we not create another human rights crisis on the other side? So unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of, I mean, the best choice is if Putin were to stop and withdraw his troops, but that's not going to happen. So I think, unfortunately, we have to be very clear and concrete in what we're doing and not just do things for the sake of doing something, which is something we often end up doing.
I know we're running out of time, so I will just say that I fully agree with my colleagues that we are between a rock and a hard place. And I would call this, in international relations, I call it the inherent tensions between sovereignty, state sovereignty to be able to do what they want within their own borders and internationally, and suffering, right? Because if a state is committing horrible atrocities against civilians, then it is causing international suffering. So we are stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if the West does escalate their response against Russia, as Dr. Navarra said, Russia is a nuclear power. So that really risks escalating the war further. However, if we do nothing, we completely erode international norms on the protection of civilians and the responsibility to protect as ingrained in the UN Charter. So if we do just stand by and watch innocent civilians become systematically displaced or murdered by a great power, that also really does erode international relations norms and expectations. So we are very much stuck between a rock and a hard place. I don't have the solution for you, but to answer Dr. Kim's question on the role of the United Nations peacekeeping, ideally it would be the United Nations peacekeeping as a multilateral observation or multidimensional mission to take the reins of international responsibility to protect. However, the way that the United Nations is designed, the Security Council members, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, have veto power over any UN-led resolution, over any UN-led peacekeeping mission. And it is, of course, no surprise to all of us that Russia is a member of the permanent 5 and has veto power over any UN mandate. So the UN is effectively paralyzed and is unable to respond beyond resolutions, beyond rhetorical condemnation at this point in time. I wish I had the answer, but I do not, and I agree with my colleagues.
Yeah, I think the last question that another scholar raised was that about the war crimes in, that's happening in Ukraine. And obviously, Biden just said yesterday, I don't know if it was intentional or not, to call it genocide the first time. And I also worry about the implications of that. So again, I agree with you, Sunita. It's really a tough choice whether this kind of escalation of responsibilities and what we need to do in terms of that. Do you have any follow-up thoughts about that, about Biden's point?
I can. I just don't want to have people stay longer because of my commentary. But yes, yesterday I also read that Biden did call Russia's crimes against civilians in Bucha as genocide and broader crimes. Up until that point, Biden had referred to Putin as a war criminal. He had referred to the crimes as war crimes and atrocities and mass killings against civilians, but he had not referred to them as genocide. This is a very important shift in rhetoric for international relations scholars, because labeling political violence as genocide means that you have a more responsibility to respond. So when Biden calls Russia's crimes against Ukraine genocide, that in theory would activate international legal obligations. And according to my research, when something is labeled as genocide, it does increase the chances of international intervention by usually over 200 to 300%. Now, of course, the important part is going to be, do Western elites follow behind Biden's assertions, or is Biden just a standalone political elite who is saying this is genocide, but his cabinet might backtrack? So we already know that Anthony Blinken has not called it genocide. He has moved away from calling it genocide, effectively because he does not want the United States to have to do more. So we'll see what happens, but it is a very important progression, and genocide would denote further responsibility to act and to stop the humanitarian abuses, which are extensive, they are systematic, and they are inexcusable in any way.
Yeah, we do have a question that kind of relates to that in the chat, asking about what do we think about the war crimes in Ukraine and how to deal with that. I think Sunita might have some more history on dealing with things in the aftermath. But yeah, it's tricky though too, because just like Sunita, Dr. Khushi said earlier, you want the war to end, but if people know that, well, if it ends, you're going to be deposed or you're going to cry, you're going to court for a long, long time, it makes getting people to stop a lot harder. So how do you balance justice versus getting it to end?
Right.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, I think we're close to the end of the time. I think some people need to go to class at 12:30. I do think that, today's panel discussion bring together, for me, some very important connections between the currents of imperialism, nationalism, and fascism, how the interplay between these 3 ideologies and structures actually complicates, the political relations and conflicts in the region. And obviously the ethnic identities that are hardened because of the hostilities in the war and would continue. And I'm worried about, the people's future And obviously the first concern is, of course, to stop the war and stop the invasion. And I think it's very informative. Thank you all of you for your insightful comments, and from the perspectives of history and memory by Dr. Goshev, and the history of international relations and state intentions by Dr. Kushi, and by the perspectives of faraway ideologies by Dr. Lavari. So again, my name is Wayne Kaito. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this panel discussion.
I want to
So-
quickly add, I put it in the chat, but if anybody wants to continue, because there's just so much more to explore, if anybody wants to continue discussion, feel free to get in touch with our global migration group. We have more events coming up also on this. And
Yeah,
we actually been pulling together some literature. So I wonder if we should approach the library and create a max guide with maybe some of the literature and information, because I think information is essential in what's going on right now. There are no good solutions, but staying informed is, I think, the key to this.
I'd like to remind all of you again about next Wednesday. We have a very special program coming up exactly the same time a week from today at 11 a.m. By two very important books about refugees issues in the world, especially focusing on Syria and Myanmar. The book about two refugees who went to Texas, Austin, Texas, and by Jessica Gaudeau. It's called After the Last Border. And then the new book by Boston University professor Herbert Goldwaite on refuge, looks at the comparison of the treatment of Syrian refugees in the US, Canada, and Germany. And the talk is going to be very fascinating by a conversation between both of them. And Dr. Lavari and I will be there to help facilitate the discussion. So please stay tuned and to see the campus announcement, and you can register for that panel discussion as well. Please stay tuned. I know that some campus groups are thinking about how to help Ukraine, and especially there's a faculty group that is being involved so far. And if you want more information, you can contact any of the speakers and they can give you a little bit more information about that as well. Okay, so I'll be again sending that email about the announcement about the talk about refugees for next week. So thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for coming and for your thoughts, our expert panelists. Thank you, Dr. Tao, for moderating, and we appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.